Hello and welcome to the Theology Mill podcast brought to you by Whitfinstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle. I'm on staff here at Whitfinstock and I'm the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with leading authors and thinkers in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. So on this episode, I chat with Dr. Andrew T. Draper. Dr. Draper is the executive director of Winebrenner Theological Seminary in Findlay, Ohio. He's also teaching pastor at Urban Light Community Church in Muncie, Indiana. And he has authored a number of books and articles on race, disability, and the church, including his 2014 Pickwick book, which is called A Theology of Race and Place, Liberation and Reconciliation in the Works of Jennings and Carter. That's talking about Willie James Jennings and J. Cameron Carter. And we discussed that book in depth in this interview. Also, Dr. Draper holds a PhD in theological ethics from the University of Aberdeen and an MDiv from Winebrenner Theological Seminary. With that, let's go ahead and jump over to the interview. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Well, I am here, very happy to be here with Dr. Andrew Draper, who is the author of the Pickwick book, A Theology of Race and Place, Liberation and Reconciliation in the Works of Jennings and Carter. Been a while since he wrote it, so I'm very grateful that he's agreed to come on and talk about it. So thank you, Andrew, for coming on the Theology Mill. As we kind of kick things off, could you maybe share with our listeners just a bit about yourself? And maybe a bit about your work, your background, and so forth.
Yeah, thank you, Zach, for having me today. It has been a while since I've published the book, so I was going back and thinking about where conversation stood in the field about a decade or even more ago when I was first starting on this work. I've been involved in pastoral, community development, and justice work for the last 21 years. I live in a post-industrial city in the Midwest that has experienced a lot of the limitations of job loss and some of the other dynamics of the market that are often visited upon people on the margins the most.
Yeah.
In recent years, I've also started working for our denominational seminary, Winebrenner Seminary in Findlay, Ohio. So I'm a part-time teaching pastor at Urban Light Church in Muncie, Indiana, and then I'm on staff at Winebrenner Seminary in Findlay. Spend a couple days there a week. My wife and I have been married for 24 years. We have 2 college-age sons, and I have a PhD in theological ethics from the University of Aberdeen in northern Scotland, and so my scholarly and publishing work has largely been related to theological anthropology, or what does it mean to be human, and questions of identity that surround that. So questions related to race, disability, and especially how we in the church can interact carefully and critically with questions of identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, one question that I open with for all of our guests is if you could place any 3 people, and these people can be dead or alive, if you could place them together in a room and listen into their conversation, which 3 people would you choose and why?
I find myself interested in and attracted to the thought of different authors at different points in the theological tradition. And from the early church, the Eastern Fathers, the Cappadocians, are very interesting, especially St. Basil the Great. So I've done some publishing work where I incorporated one of his sermons in a volume on poverty. So I'd love to hear more from him in conversation with the medieval theologian and contemplative Catherine of Siena. I've always found her work especially fascinating because it combines a robust spirituality of prayer, and at the same time, she thinks carefully about issues related to poverty and justice. And then finally, it would be fascinating to hear how modern liberation theology would intersect with the works of those authors as they both think carefully about questions related to poverty. And so Gustavo Gutierrez would be very interesting to have as part of that conversation, because as he was thinking about the work of the Church for liberation in his context as a Peruvian priest, hearing how their conceptions of social justice might be similar and different would be fascinating to listen to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The connections between Gutierrez and, like you were saying, the conceptions of social justice in the Eastern Church Fathers and Mothers. I'm sure somebody has done that kind of work. But yeah, that would be really, really fascinating to actually hear themselves talk about it. Okay, so let's look at your book a little bit. So obviously you're writing about, well, maybe it's not obvious to our listeners, but you're writing about a couple contemporary African-American theologians, so Willie Jennings and J. Cameron Carter. So for listeners who might not be aware or who might not know much about these two, who are Jennings and Carter? And then maybe what are some of just sort of the basic contours of each of their kind of intellectual projects?
When I started closely reading their work in preparation for writing, it was, I believe, late 2010, maybe 2011. So we're talking, 13, 14 years ago,
Yeah.
when their works had first come out. And Jennings' published work, The Christian Imagination, came out after J. Cameron Carter's work, Race, A Theological Account. However, since they were both at Duke Divinity School at the time, it was clear that there were conversations and connections being made between Jennings' work and Carter's thesis. So
Mhm.
Jennings is currently a professor of Africana Studies at Yale Divinity School. He was the longtime dean at Duke Divinity School. His work, The Christian Imagination, was a seminal work in thinking about theology and race. It was a game changer because instead of saying, here's how Christian theology is resistant to racism, or in his work, the racialized imagination, he was saying, here is how certain strands in the tradition, and particularly in the medieval Western tradition, not only contributed to, but also were instrumental in the formation of what we understand as modern, the modern racist imagination, grounded as it is in whiteness being on top
Yeah.
and aligning other peoples, non-Western, non-European peoples, in a hierarchical scale of civilization. So
Mhm.
basically, he was looking at theology done at the time of colonization, and then through the modern missions movement, and some other pieces of the puzzle, but making the contention that race is a theological construct that could only be formed at the nexus of the intercultural interactions that were across power differentials at the time of colonization, and then that they were narrated theologically. And so he connects the racialized scale, which was grounded in blood purity laws in the Iberian Peninsula in the 16th century, 15th and 16th century. He connects the racialized scale that was forming during the time of colonization with theological move that was happening at the same time, which was to narrate Europeans as being at the center of God's saving work in the world, as the new Israel. So concepts of manifest destiny and concepts of being a city on a hill, concepts of being the chosen people of God, right? Those are biblical concepts, not manifest destiny, but the others were biblical concepts that were carried forward uncritically into the Western imagination in ways that said, hey, the other folks we're encountering are the ethnos, right? The nations, the Gentiles, those who are at the edges or the peripheries of salvation. And so he was demonstrating how colonization, the early conceptions of missiology and racism were developing alongside one another in sort of mutually articulating ways, building one another up. And so his work was a game changer because it took seriously the potential of the Christian faith to join diverse peoples together in one body while saying, here's how we've done it badly. So I think that's where it was distinct from both redeployments of the tradition, which just kind of says, racism isn't Christian. He's saying, no, actually, it has a profound Christian heritage. While at the same time, not just giving the somewhat limited answer that liberation theology in various forms can sometimes tend to. And again, this is not to cast aspersions on liberation theology or to lump it all together, but to say rather that at times some strands in traditions of liberation theology can tend to conflate any confessional Christian belief with dominance and power and colonization in ways that may not take seriously the undercurrents in the tradition. So anyway, I think his work was a game changer in that it read the tradition against itself in some very interesting ways. J. Cameron Carter's work was maybe a bit more wide-ranging in the sense of pulling together quite a few different discourses in a way that maybe didn't build quite as unified of a narrative as Jennings' work, but nonetheless was also interested in continuing what we could identify as Jennings' thesis that supersessionism or replacement theology, that the Western church is the new Israel, right? That Carter was saying, yeah, that's the problem. Let me draw it forward into modernity. Let me show you how Western idealism, the Enlightenment, and what we think of as, or what the tradition has tended to think of as modern rationalized thought, is in fact grounded in theological missteps that place certain people groups at the center of understanding what it means to be human, particularly white folks. And so when both of these works use the word whiteness, that word has morphed and taken on some different meaning over the last decade or so. But when they're using it, they're saying the racialized scale that was explicitly constructed by dominating Western powers in conversation with theology. So they are drawing some from sociological concepts in legal theories such as critical race theory, but it would be a mistake to fold their theological work into just sociology or whatever the case might be. And so that's the distinction I'm making, is that some of those terms like whiteness and others have taken on a life of their own in critical discourse in modern society, in recent contemporary society in the last decade, that maybe are slightly distinct from the way that I read those words as being used in Jennings and Carter's work in 2008 and 2010. So taken together, I see their works as telling somewhat of a unified narrative, although perhaps in their later works, the way they would tell that narrative has diverged more. I would say at that time, it perhaps told a bit of a more similar story.
Yeah, that's a really helpful framing of it. So thank you. I think you used the word join at least once or twice already, and that's one of the things I picked up on when I was reading the book. Is kind of all throughout the text you're using this language of kind of joining, right, of people kind of joining to one another, or peoples joining to one another. So I'm curious, what do you mean by this term when you use the word join? What exactly are you meaning? And then is that something that you've developed on your own? Is that something you're drawing from the writings of Jennings or Carter?
Yeah, that word is the word that Jennings uses over and over in the Christian
Mhm. Yeah.
imagination. So when I pull that word forward into my work, I'm borrowing it from his work. Carter uses the word miscegenation several times in a subversive sort of way. So basically, I read both scholars as pointing out how reconciliation has been deployed as an oppressive and faulty construct many
Yeah.
times in the modern church. And so you've got this Pauline word related to reconciliation that takes into play exchange. And yet we've come to understand it today as more just kind of a get along and have good feelings toward one another, love one another in a
Yeah.
spiritual or non-material way that doesn't necessarily take into account power disparities, injustice, history of conquest and racialization. And so reconciliation, oftentimes in many contemporary projects and many contemporary tellings, comes off as kind of like, well, whoever is not in the dominant culture, just kind of get on board with what the people in power are doing and join them in it and stop being
Mhm.
angry. And that's the love of Christ,
Yeah.
right? And
Mhm. Mhm.
they're saying, well, that's a problematic framework because to envision reconciliation, I think Jennings says something along the lines of that reconciliation may not be an irretrievable concept, but that most church folk and the most of the theological academy may be pretty unprepared for in his telling what that actually entails. And so that's why they have to get at the heart of the way that concept has been problematically deployed in the past and carrying over into the present to be able to point to more hopeful ways of thinking about being one. And so Jennings uses language of eros or joining to say that it brings material realities together, that bodies are connected to land, people groups are connected to
Mhm.
space and the histories
Mhm.
that go along with those spaces, which takes into account economies and politics and the environment and food systems and so on and so forth. All of those things contribute to our self-understanding as people and cultures and even ethnic groups. And I don't mean that in a reified sense, but in a more descriptive sense of particular cultural configurations. People, we know ourselves as creatures based on our interaction with the world around us in many ways. The
Yeah.
stories we tell about where we fit in the world are drawn from living in that world. And so I think Jennings is pointing us especially to, hey, stop trying to pull concepts of reconciliation out of material realities into kind of this ethereal world of getting along, because if that's what we're talking about, that's going to very easily dovetail into the modern processes of racialization
Mhm.
in how people have imagined the world as functioning. Instead, what does it mean to really enter someone else's space as a guest rather than dominating, rather than the way Westerners have tended to enter spaces not their own, which has been
Mhm.
to extract resources, to control, to set up power, to race toward land ownership and private property. How instead can we enter space one another's spaces as guests? What does it mean to think about oneself as a guest? And that's why he's getting to the theological problem of supersessionism, because he's saying, what if Westerners and what if Christians in particular thought of themselves as Gentiles who once were far off from God and have been brought near, but we've been brought near into a story not our own, right? So
Mhm.
we are guests in the history of salvation, biblically and theologically speaking. So if that's the case, then what does that have to say to our interactions with one another? And that's why he uses the word joining, why he draws specifically from erotic kind of terminology, is to say that, hey, joining can be, an oppressive moment, or it can be a really mutual kind of moment. And
Yeah.
so I think Carter is then pushing against modern concepts of blood purity or cultural progress by utilizing what were racist fears of miscegenation and turning them against concepts of blood purity to say, hey, if we're really going to do this right, it means that people who have thought of themselves as being in the driver's seat need to give up false conceptions of purity and take a back seat for a while and learn what this gospel thing is all about.
So is what Carter is doing with miscegenation, is that similar at all to, I'm only asking this because I know you write about Brian Bantam quite a bit in the book as well. Is it similar to what Brian Bantam's doing with his whole mulatto theology project?
I think there are similarities. I think the distinctions might be that I read Bantam's work as more comfortable with the tradition in ways that Carter's work is not. I think
Mhm.
Carter's work, especially recently, has diverged or been more distrustful of some of the theological terminology that he would have used early on. I think that
Sure.
there are some of the modern projects of redeploying the tradition, such as radical orthodoxy, that while Carter was always somewhat distrustful of them, I think that he would probably, again, I can't put words in his mouth,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
seems like in his recent work that he is a bit more skeptical of Christian theological language as being able to fix the problems it's created.
Sure.
I read Bantam as still being a bit more conversant with the tradition. So maybe at one point in time their languages were a bit more similar. I don't know. I think Redeeming Mulatto is aimed at subverting the what we've come to understand as the racialized scale that I was discussing earlier. But I think it might be a little bit more hopeful about joining as a theological project than
Hmm.
some of Carter's recent work might be. I think I read Carter more recently as being more firmly grounded in the anarchic or subversive potential found in many different strands of Black theology and spirituality
Hmm.
in ways that are saying, hey, we need to take this seriously as a contribution of various different strands in ways that can subvert the false religion of whiteness in ways that I'm not sure that Bantam's work is quite as interested in doing.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm not locating myself in that conversation as much as just trying to say that I think that to read them as similar now would be do a disservice to their works, but
Yeah.
that
Sure.
perhaps some of the terminology that they were utilizing, I think Bantam's work came out in what, 2012, was it? I don't remember, 2011, something like that. At the time, him being a student at Duke, I think he was kind of in between the Hauerwasian way of thinking about virtue and tradition and sort of the Jennings way of thinking about the tradition as carrying forward the supersessionism of the early church.
Hmm.
Um, and I think Carter's work is kind of coming from a different trajectory altogether in recent years, where it's more interested in exploring the distinct contributions of Black religious studies traditions in ways that may subvert what he views as problematic histories in Western theology.
Yeah. Sure. Sure. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned already a good bit this label of whiteness that Jennings and Carter both kind of utilize, right? This sort of way of life that they call whiteness, and you talked about whiteness as this kind of like racialized scale that sociologists have kind of used in their analysis of race. So maybe unpacking this a little bit more in terms of how Jennings and Carter use the term. What do you think whiteness is exactly in their view, on the one hand, and then also why do they see it as kind of a problem?
In recent works, I think that they would both picture whiteness as some form of a false gospel,
Mm-hmm.
elevating an idealized kind of human Christ in a way that marginalizes non-white bodies. I think that the word took on such strength in their works because Jennings was saying, hey, I'm using this language of critical theory, but I'm using it in subversive ways, not because I'm just pulling over sociology into a theological account, but specifically because when you look at the writings of theological chroniclers in the New World who were coming from the quote unquote old world to the new world as part of either colonial expeditions or part of setting up in encomiendas or other land structures in the New World. If you look at those theological works, they explicitly use language of white, brown, black, and because they're coming from the Iberian Peninsula, they're often in Spanish. So words like negro, words like mulatto, words like mestizo, all of those are words that we still, in modern parlance, recognize what they mean, and they're drawn from ways of categorizing humanity that were profoundly racist and power hungry from 500 years ago or more. And so because those theological works were so concerned with people not intermarrying and not intermixing, but if they did, here's the people groups that were produced from those illicit unions, and keeping white on the top so that blood purity would remain. Those works were coining the word white. So when Jennings and Carter and others are using that word whiteness, it's actually an historically informed word. They're saying this is language that we didn't create, that was drawn from theological studies during the age of colonial conquest. So I'm making that important distinction to say that sometimes today the way the word whiteness is used is it's used in a more ahistorical manner as simply a sociological or critical theory term. And then by some people who aren't thinking in terms of systems, they're then turning that word around in ways that are no longer subversive theologically in the same way that perhaps Jennings and Carter were using those terms a decade and a half ago. So I'm not saying we shouldn't use the term whiteness. I'm just saying it doesn't always translate out of the academy very well. The average person's like, well, what do you mean by whiteness? What do you mean by blackness? Because they are hearing those terms in the modernized way that we've come to understand them as racial concepts.
Right.
So in my book, I try to push back against some of those more contemporary ways of utilizing those terms while trying to present fairly how I read Jennings and Carter's using them. But then sometimes outside of conversations like this, or outside of scholarly articles or presentations, it doesn't always translate, and people are like, wait, what are you actually saying? And it just takes some work of filling in, here's what I'm talking about, right? I'm not talking first and foremost about skin color, although it was developed out of a group of people who saw themselves as white and needed to be, in their own telling, white in order to be true, good, beautiful, and pure, right? So obviously I am, in the modern world, a white man who is doing theological work on race and disability and other disciplines where I'm pulling from artists on the margins. Even though I am part of the disability community in multiple ways, I'm not part of Black church traditions in a way of being able to say, this is a tradition I was raised in or grew in. Now, many of the my mentors and pastors and authors and theologians that I've worked alongside over the years have been part of Black church traditions who have invited me in, but that still doesn't mean that it's my own. And so I do need to take realities seriously, such as whiteness and white privilege, and I need to think through those concepts carefully in my own place in the discourse, while at the same time realizing that they are still helpful concepts that don't lead to self-hatred, right? It's not like I'm beating up on how I was born. I'm rather taking my history seriously and thinking
Yeah.
through our histories together seriously to say, what work do we need to do to be involved in joining, to be involved in redistributing power, to be involved in justice, to be involved in these kind of movements? What's the critical work that we need to be doing? And so I tried to, with my work in theological race theory, enter the conversation as a learner before a teacher, to kind of try to demonstrate that posture of being a guest.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate what you're saying about some of the difficulties of the language for people who are not coming from the theological academy or just academy in general. Like when I've been adjuncting this Christian ethics class this fall for undergrads, and I encountered the same sort of difficulty. I was like, I think I was teaching a lesson on Black theology, and the two people I was kind of focusing on were Willie Jennings and James Cone, and I brought up this idea of whiteness because they both use that language, and blackness. And it was almost like it didn't matter what else I said. Like, no,
Right.
didn't matter how thoroughly I explained it. Like, as soon as they heard me say whiteness and blackness, I mean, obviously I can't get inside their heads, but I know a lot of them expressed kind of distaste for this. It was like they couldn't, like, it was hard to get around this idea that this way of thinking was trying to like shame them, shame, because a lot of them are white. A lot of the students are
Yeah.
white, trying to kind of shame them for having white skin or something. And I was trying to explain, like you were saying, that while it's related to skin color, someone like Jennings is not necessarily talking only about skin color, but a profounder issue. But yeah, just the word itself,
Yeah.
it was like a block or a barrier for them that a lot of them couldn't get around.
Yeah. I mean, because that's a great point. And if we take seriously economic, political histories and histories of violence, we need to take seriously the violence in the modern era that white Westerners have inflicted upon others. I mean,
Right.
we in this country need to take seriously the history of the transatlantic slave trade. We've never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right?
Right.
Reconstruction didn't work in this country in a way that worked for the liberation of the oppressed. It worked for
Yeah.
rebuilding the wealth of the plantation owners, right? Like
Right.
General Sherman's field order was overturned. Like, so when we take serious the history of whiteness, we while we are talking about cultural ideals shared by people of lighter skin color historically, it's also a political, religious, and economic way of being in the world that has often exerted itself through violence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's how they're using the term whiteness. But yeah, I mean, like, people lose their ever loving minds as soon as you bring it up. And
Yeah.
one of two things, I mean, we could explain that as, well, they just don't understand how we're trying to use it. And so I can try to clarify all day long
Yeah.
that discourse, but in some ways, I think it's also sometimes in people's best interest to not understand how it's trying to be used.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
because if you can say, he's just, being the new racist,
Yeah,
then
exactly.
it's easier to dismiss.
Yeah.
Now, one of the pieces of the puzzle, let me just say this real quick and then we can move on.
Yeah.
One of the pieces of the puzzle that I don't think has been adequately considered in discourses around whiteness is the reality of, alongside the transatlantic slave trade, the white working underclass who were considered waste peoples and sent to the New World to do the dirty work. I'm not saying that by any means compared to the atrocities of the slave trade. I don't mean that at all.
Yeah.
What I'm meaning instead is I think there are some folks today, and maybe it's people in power who've taught them to think this way. I don't know. But there are some folks on the bottom who are white folks who haven't had some of the advantages that I've had, for instance, who hear the word whiteness in a very different way because they're like, well, what have I gotten from being white? I grew up in Appalachia and in one of the poorest counties with highest child poverty in the country. But I think sometimes what we do see, though, it is that there's a learned, then misplaced hatred of Black and brown folks that, white folks on the bottom are being told by people at the top that it's immigrants or non-white people who are stealing your jobs.
Right.
And so people on the bottom are turned against one another in some ways. It would be interesting. I know some of that work has been done in sociological studies, but I mean, in theological studies, some folks, not accusing Jennings and Carter of this, but some folks use the term whiteness uncritically in ways that don't take into account that reality and what would happen if people on the margins actually stood up to say, there are components of this system that are oppressing us in the same ways, that are marginalizing us in the same ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so then, as far as like an alternative to this kind of way of life that Jennings and Carter call whiteness, do they offer some kind of positive alternative? And then if so, like what are maybe some of the major markers of this alternative way of life?
I think joining is the word that I've pulled forward from Jennings to try to give a picture of that alternative way of life. Jennings doesn't sketch it out in great detail. He does say that it involves land distribution. It involves ownership of space. In other words, pay attention to in your communities when land is being bought up. Pay attention to how at times educational, religious, and political and economic systems are aligned to control space, maybe with disregard to the people there or disregard to the natural environment. Like, pay attention to that stuff, because if we're going to really join histories to one another, we need to take seriously the histories that came before us, and that involves being created creatures, bodies, material beings in spaces. So I think for him, joining to one another in ways that we share space and take seriously subverting some of the oppressive historical mandates of the market are important things to do. And so that's part of the community development and justice work that I've been a part of over the years is trying to think through how do those questions hit the ground with housing development, with incarceration, with re-entry into society, with job creation, with addiction recovery, with distribution and access to medical resources, right? All of those questions are tied up in what joining entails. That's why it's not simply reconciliation in the church in a disembodied kind of way, but it's a fully orbed, holistic way. And so I think that's where Jennings is pointing and kind of calling for other people to take that mantle up. And I think that's what I've tried to do then in my own work, talking about food distribution at the end of A Theology of Race and Place, the works that I've done on poverty and disability, my other published works and papers over the years, I've been trying to tackle similar questions. And I think that's the hopeful work that we're being pointed to at the end of the Christian imagination.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Maybe looking to kind of the legacy of Black theology that Jennings and Carter are working with. Obviously, they're engaged with, right? But how is the work of Jennings and Carter distinct, or maybe different from the work of prior folks in kind of the Black theology world? And especially, I'd love to hear your thoughts on James Cone. So maybe how are Jennings and Carter presenting something that's maybe a bit different from what James Cone was up to?
Yeah, so I think Jennings and Carter are both pulling from the Black Religious and Theological Academy in multiple explicit and implicit ways. The work of James Cone, the work of Dolores Williams, the work of Charles Long, the work of Albert Raboteau, and others have informed their work. Specifically, I mean, James Cone was just a bombshell of articulating what the gospel means in terms of racial injustice and segregation in the United States. It would be impossible to overstate the importance of his work as a theology of Black liberation and Black power. I think Jennings and Carter, at least in the works Christian Imagination and Race, a Theological Account, are a bit more nuanced than Cone. Cone was speaking very clearly he was giving the intellectual voice to the Christian components of the Black Power movement in a lot of ways. And so I think he was very much saying, I don't want you to miss what I'm saying here. So I'm going to say it very clearly. White theology is a heresy. It is this. And Black theology is the theology of Jesus, and it's the theology of the God who is the God of the oppressed, right? He's saying, don't miss my point. So when he talks about like Jesus being Black, again, even that is not a reified skin color for Cone. It is, he even acknowledged, he says, maybe sometime in the distant future, if racial injustice is really, we make a ton of progress on it, maybe we don't have to talk in such stark white-Black terms. He's going, but for now, guess what? We inherited this language, and there's no other way to talk about Jesus being oppressed than to say Jesus is Black, right? So that's the work Cone is doing. And I think Jennings and Carter they would both say how much they owe to Cone.
Mm-hmm.
I think Carter has tried to follow in Cone's footsteps a bit more closely in offering Black religion as an antidote to or subversive alternative to what he would call the false religion of whiteness. Jennings, I think, pushes back against whiteness in ways that are a bit, perhaps, at least explicitly more hopeful about some of the prospects of joining, even if I'm not saying that he's opposed to Cone's project at all. That's not what I mean. But rather his language is perhaps a bit more nuanced in that regard. But yeah, so just to sum up, they both acknowledge very clearly their alignment with Cone in many ways, while Carter pushes back some against Cone's reification of racial categories. Carter calls it the Blackness that whiteness created, for instance. And Jennings speaks a little bit more hopefully, perhaps, of joining than the early Cone did. Now, in the later Cone, in like Cross and the Lynching Tree, he talks a little bit more about the bond of blood that has been between white and Black folks. Yes, often in violence, but also in the body of Christ, in sexual union, in other. He's just pointing to embodied components that are a bit more, I think he even says in Crossing the Lynching Tree near the end, white folks are still our sisters and brothers, even if they've been bad sisters and brothers. So, I think we would be mistaken to try to make too much space between Cone and Jennings and Carter, but at the same time, their projects are definitely distinct from one another.
Yeah, yeah. And Carter's kind of critical of this idea of black theology, of that sort of label, isn't he? Which Cohn is obviously is much more partial
Well,
to.
he is, at least in Race, a theological account.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
I mean, in his more recent work on the anarchic spirituality of blackness, I think he would still push back against the ways that black theology has inherited concepts from white theology that are unhelpful, while at the same time being its own group of traditions. I'm not saying he thinks it's just totally recreating all of the mistakes of white theology, but I would say I would think that he would say that there are problematic legacies brought forward in some black theological projects, and therefore I think that's part of why he's trying to subvert theological language, at least in my reading, in his more recent works. We'll see how helpful that is. I think for the academy, it might be pretty helpful.
Mhm.
You know, I work in the church. I work in training pastors, and I constantly have to think about how does this translate to pulpits? How does it translate to justice work in local communities? And I don't think Carter would be nearly as interested in that. That's not his project, right? His project
Right.
is he's a professor of religious studies, and so he's interested in different questions than the questions I'm asking.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes sense. You mentioned earlier how Carter and Jennings were at Duke around the same time, and or at the same time, and Bantam too. But to maybe focus in on Carter and Jennings, particularly within this kind of Duke context, that their early writings kind of emerged out of, or their early book publications at least kind of emerged out of, because we see both of them kind of engaging with a lot of these major kind of intellectual currents that are often associated with the Duke scene, and they do so at times appreciatively, but also quite critically. Two of these sort of engagements that you talk about in the book are Carter's engagement with radical orthodoxy, and then Jennings' engagement with virtue ethics. So I thought maybe we could kind of consider each of those in turn. So maybe let's start with Carter's treatment of radical orthodoxy. So does he find kind of any redeeming qualities in the radical orthodoxy of someone like John Milbank? And then on the other hand, what issues does he take with this kind of style of thinking?
Yeah, if I remember right, I think John Milbank might have been one of the external readers on Carter's dissertation,
Oh,
which
interesting. Okay.
ended up being published as Race, a Theological Account.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't be surprised if some of the incorporation of some of the church fathers and mothers in the Western tradition in Carter's work draws out of some of those radical orthodoxy currents while
Yeah.
also being pretty critical of them. I don't think that I think at one point that maybe it was that book or another book was even being considered to be part of, uh, uh, or maybe he was asked to be part of the Radical Orthodoxy Reader. I don't remember,
Oh,
but
wow. Okay.
something along those lines. And I don't think that he was interested in being part of that intellectual project for multiple reasons. And I think I would read that as simply saying, yeah, there are subversive strands in the Christian tradition that are liberating, but we can't just uncritically redeploy orthodoxy as a way to fix all the problems of injustice without also taking seriously the historical development of orthodoxy and some of the power dynamics at play there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So personally, I'm not criticizing orthodoxy as a theological commitment as much as to say that we need to take seriously the way that certain concepts and language were particularly drawn from traditions that were not inclusive of a broad variety of traditions and were in collusion at times with empire, right? And we have to at
Mhm.
least take seriously the kind of work like Justo Gonzalez has done in, you know, being very open to, at least personally, I am in agreement with the creeds, for instance. But
Right.
I think folks like Justo Gonzalez have said, hey, let's look at the socio-political realities of the seedbeds of the conversations that were going on in the development of Orthodoxy, how they were brought together under Constantine and developed as tools, or at least aids, to bring the empire together, right? So I think Carter is trying to say, and again, I'm not trying to put words in his mouth, but I read him as being resistant to radical orthodoxy, because he's saying you can't just say be more orthodox and you'll be less racist.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like, do Eucharist better and you'll be joined better.
Right.
Baptize right. Think about reconciliation in ways that subvert the market and you'll be more inclined to pursue justice. I think he's saying, hold on, we have to take seriously the ways in which even some of those activities, like the Eucharist, were and have been historically deployed as certain people's hosting, owning, oppressing in ways that are problematic. And so I think he's especially looking at the Anglo tradition there of John Milbank, who is kind of like, hey, just do all the Anglican, just get British Orthodoxy and continental philosophy right, and you're going to be cool. Well, maybe not, right? So I get the sense that that's what Carter's pushing back on. Now, I think that there are similar questions at play in Jennings' critique of virtue ethics. It's not as maybe explicit, perhaps, but there's definitely an implicit critique of virtue ethics in the way that Jennings says, hey, look over here, ding, 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 let's pay attention to how Aristotelian frameworks of anthropology were pulled forward at late medievalism, at the time of colonization, to say this is what the true good and the beautiful look like, and here's what it means to be a virtuous person, in ways that denigrated and marginalized non-white peoples. So I think he's trying to say to someone like Hauerwas, Hauerwas, you are rightly so an anti-empire theologian, but you also then are really invested in this Aristotelian tradition of virtue ethics that has all these problems in it and helped create the theological underpinnings of the modern arm of the arm of power of the empire through Western colonization. And so I think he's saying, hey, at least pay attention here to what's going on. Now, I think he would be against violence, much like Hauerwas is. I'm not trying to say that they don't have any similarities. I think Jennings is probably a bit more confessional than in a traditioned sort of way, perhaps, than some liberation theologies have been. But I think he also is saying, thinking in terms of spiritual practice and virtue doesn't necessarily fix everything. In fact, spiritual practices have often been deployed in ways that have reified and held up and created images of God that are laden with and invested in power structures that marginalize people.
Yeah. That's one of those times where, like, at Duke, I would have I'd pay money to be a fly on the wall of any conversation those two might have had. I don't know how much they engaged personally. Like, I just have no idea, because I wasn't there. I mean, I was a freshman in high school or whatever when Jennings published his first book. But it's one of those things where I'd pay money to listen to those two have a conversation about their work.
Yeah,
maybe.
I think. I'm sorry to interrupt. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're good. No, go ahead.
I was just going to theorize that perhaps some of the disintegration, or at least profound changes that we've seen at Duke between religious studies and divinity in recent years could be, in some sense, related to those kind of questions.
Yeah.
Maybe being worked out in real time.
Sure.
I'm not a Duke person, so I can only theorize. But because it is Duke Divinity School, and because I've paid attention to some of the currents there, I can only theorize that. I'm not saying it's a Hauerwasian camp and that it was a Jennings camp. I'm just saying that I think critical discourse surrounding the tradition, virtue, race, theologies of identity, I think those all have ways of colliding.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, I wanna maybe give you a chance to just share a little bit about maybe ways that you try to build upon the work of Carter and Jennings, or maybe kind of refine some of their thinking within this book of yours. Obviously, it's a decade old, or however long. But I'm curious if there are kind of any like constructive, or maybe even critical kind of maneuvers that you yourself are making as you engage with Carter and Jennings.
I write much more explicitly for faith communities. I'm not saying that I don't have one foot in the academy. I do. I publish, I teach, but I'm not a scholar of the likes of Willie Jennings, for instance, or a religious studies scholar the likes of J. Cameron Carter. I'm a theological ethicist, so I do work at the intersection of doctrinal commitments and practical theology with a view toward just, liberating, and even confessional practices in faith communities. So in other words, I want to personally take seriously the role of the church in either carrying forward harmful practices
Mm-hmm.
or working for the well-being of those who are part of our faith communities and the communities in which we live. And so for that reason, Jennings and Carter's work has been immensely helpful to me because it's helped me to understand the nexus of the problem.
Right.
You know, I exist in predominantly evangelical spaces, and so as someone raised in white evangelicalism, why is it, for instance, that when I was first involved in community development work, I could only think about racial reconciliation in terms of being the one to bring God's work to others?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why was I inoculated against paying attention to what is already going on in communities? Now, again, I'm oversimplifying here, but my imagination was shaped by the way that white evangelicals are taught that missions should function. You know, go to the ends of the earth. The ends of the earth are never pictured as the place that you are, right?
Right.
Like, in a way that your body, your history is never pictured as a peripheral moment in salvation history that has been joined into God's work centered in another people group. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the intellectual exercises when you talk about salvation in certain church contexts, and I don't think this is just white evangelical contexts. I also think many white progressive contexts
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
have this exact same problem. When we talk about things like salvation, you know, both exclusivist views of salvation and universalist views of salvation tend to still have intellectual exercises like, hey, well, what about the tribe in Africa who's never heard of Christ, right? It's always those other people over there that are not me.
Yeah.
And I think that's just what Jennings and Carter are saying is there's a profound misreading of salvation history.
Mm-hmm.
If
Mm-hmm.
if your own ethnic and theological tradition is the center of God's saving work, or at least if you act like you own the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of have to be honest that that's the way. How often do both white progressive and white conservative church and missions programs function as if they have all the right answers before being in conversation with the communities that they are purporting to serve?
Mm-hmm.
Here's what we need to fix. Here's what needs to be done. whether you're so this project, the work I'm trying to do goes beyond left and right. I think since I work in evangelical contexts, and I would even identify in a lot of ways as an evangelical, I think a lot of people can just read my work as, oh, well, that's just liberal or that's just progressive, not
Yeah.
understanding that this work actually cuts against conservative and progressive ways of thinking about bodies and race that presume that we can figure the world out
Hmm.
without interacting with those on the margins in our spaces in which we live. And so my work at the end of my published work tries to, I use food as an example to try to push forward into what does it mean to be a joined community that brings together different traditions. And I use food with some of our
Yeah.
own, the work
Yeah.
that we've done in our community through community gardening and shared meals and other things to try to say, what does the joined community look like in terms of food? But it can work in my later works in a variety of different ways. What does it work in terms of accessibility when we think about disability?
Hmm.
What is it? What does joining have to say to the way we think about missions and poverty? Right? I did the Fuller Missiology lectures in 2017, and I have an essay in the IVP book, Can White People Be Saved? And in
Hmm.
that book, I talk about 5 spiritual practices for white Christians to resist the centering of white identity and to be guests and learners. And in that, I talk about what are ways that we can, as Christians, be seriously involved in missiology that doesn't simply duplicate the problems that we've inherited and sometimes participate in, right?
Yeah.
So in
Yeah.
that work, in the reader on Christian mission and poverty that I did for the Sacred Roots book series, and then my recent work as a co-author on disabling leadership, in those books, I'm still thinking in terms of joining and justice and
Hmm.
trying to push it forward into constructive projects. So while my work has been distinct from and very different from Jennings and Carter's work in a lot of ways, I still have their work back there as a crucial moment in my development and a framework that I draw from as I try to think carefully about justice and joining in constructive and practical ways.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to also give you a chance as we kind of come to a close here. Maybe just to say where listeners can find you, if you're online anywhere. Where can they learn maybe more about your work? And then, secondly, do you have any works in progress or anything that you'd like to plug here?
Well, I just got done plugging those recent books that I did in the last few
Yeah,
years
yeah,
since
yeah.
Theology of Race and Place, so I don't need to do that again, other than to say you can find me, my author page on Amazon. What would be even more helpful than simply picking up a book would be to review it online on maybe
Mm,
your blog, or to put an Amazon review up or something like that. That's always
mhm.
helpful to, so that as people are looking at the works, they can kind of see what's going on there. I'm on social media a little less in a serious kind of manner than I used to be. As Twitter turned into X, I, kind of have been on there a little less. I do have
Yeah.
a Twitter site that I haven't posted on in months, Andrew T. Draper. I do have a public Facebook page that I do some blogging at here and there. I have a website that's andrewtdraper.com. You can find me in my professional capacity at urbanlightmuncie.com, and that's my part-time capacity, and my administrative academic capacity at Winebrenner Theological Seminary. My capacity at Winebrenner, I do some teaching there, but I work in administration there, and we are an evangelical school affiliated with the Churches of God General Conference, who trains pastors, leaders, and clinical counselors for kingdom work. So I am involved in a variety of different ways at those different spots.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll leave a spattering of links in the show notes for folks to find you at all those various places. Andrew, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to chat. I think Jennings and Carter and your use of them, this is such an important conversation. So thank you for giving me and giving our listeners this opportunity to learn from you and from these two theological heavyweights.
Hey, thank you so much, Zachariah. I appreciate it. It was kind of you to invite me, and thank you for the good work that you all are doing at Whip and Stock.